My name is Grace Thompson. I'm 32 years old, mother to a young boy, and I live with my husband Daniel in a modest home on Oak Ridge Avenue just outside of Austin, Texas. We had been renting that place for 5 years. Although the neighborhood could get noisy at times, it was a peaceful enough spot to raise our son, Ethan. Nothing could have prepared us for what was about to unfold. I had always been skeptical of anything supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, energies, none of that ever made sense to me. In fact, I used to chuckle when others brought up such things. I was the practical type, grounded in logic. I believed only in what I could see, or at least I used to. It all began on January 6th, Three Kings Day. Daniel came home with a metallic blue gift bag. When I opened it, my eyes lit up. It was an Ava, one of those smart assistants all the neighbors already had. I'd been asking for it for months. People said it could play music, tell you recipes, answer questions, even crack jokes. I was excited to feel a bit more up to date, to have a little helper around like everyone else. That same day, we set it up. We decided to place it in our bedroom, on the nightstand across from the bed. That evening, we tested the basics. We asked it to play songs, tell a joke, and even Ethan, who was just 5, couldn't stop laughing every time Ava replied. It was a lovely evening, warm and full of laughter, one of those nights you wish you could save in a jar. But what followed was anything but that. And if you're someone who enjoys stories like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, tap the bell, and tell us in the comments what your most terrifying experience has been. Maybe, like me, you thought these things didn't happen, but I promise you, after what we lived through, I no longer dare to laugh at anything. That first night went by peacefully. Ethan fell asleep between us, still giggling over Ava's silly jokes. Daniel turned off the lights. We said our goodnights, and I drifted off, thinking about how helpful it would be to have that cheerful voice assisting with chores. Never in my worst thoughts did I imagine that same voice, so friendly and polite, would soon whisper things I never wanted to hear. Words that even now I can't forget. It was that very night when Ethan began to cry. It must have been exactly 3 in the morning when I heard his little feet rushing down the hallway. He burst into our room, sobbing, clinging to his pajamas. It wasn't the first time this had happened since we moved him into his own bedroom a few months earlier. He'd usually make up some excuse. He had a bad dream, heard a noise, or just missed sleeping with us. But that night, his cries were different. These weren't tantrums. This was fear. Real, raw fear. I scooped him into my arms, trying to soothe him. Daniel sat up too, asking him what was wrong. But Ethan didn't answer. He just cried harder, wrapping his arms tightly around my neck. We laid him between us, and as I rocked him gently, we suddenly heard a loud thud coming from his room, like something had hit the ground or a door being slammed shut. Daniel reacted immediately. He grabbed his phone to use the flashlight and walked out. I stayed back, heart racing, holding Ethan close while I listened to my husband's footsteps as he moved through the house. It didn't take long for him to return, face puzzled. Nothing's out of place. Everything's locked. Windows, front door. It's all fine, he said, casting a quick glance at Ava, which sat silently on the nightstand. We tried not to dwell on it. Maybe it was street noise. Maybe something had fallen on its own. But I couldn't shake the feeling I got from Ethan. His skin was cold, drenched in sweat, and he kept trembling for over half an hour. That night we slept with the lights on. Not for him, for me. It was the first time I felt something wasn't right in the house, as if the air had thickened. Still, we pretended everything was normal the next day. We used Ava again, like nothing had happened. Just another rough night with a kid, we told ourselves. The following days felt normal. We played around with the smart assistant, listened to music while I cleaned, and I even asked for new recipes. I kept telling myself it had been a coincidence, that I was imagining things. But deep down, something inside me had shifted. A quiet unease settled in. I couldn't explain it, but I no longer slept with the same peace. I didn't realize that the noise, the footsteps, and my son's terrified cry were only the beginning, and that the cheerful voice we had invited into our home was about to turn everything upside down. By the third day, things seemed calmer. Ethan had returned to sleeping in his room, though he insisted we leave the door open. I understood. I too sensed a strange discomfort lingering in the air, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to feed the fear. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Daniel was snoring gently beside me, and the room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the TV's power light. I was caught somewhere between waking and dreaming when something made me open my eyes. I can't say if it was a noise or just instinct, but I opened them, and there it was, a tall, motionless shadow right beside the nightstand where Ava sat. It didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Thin, looming, it appeared to be watching us. I froze in place, paralyzed by fear. I couldn't even scream. Then, without anyone saying a word, Ava's robotic, feminine voice suddenly spoke. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you please repeat it?" Daniel sat up immediately, eyes wide, completely confused. He turned on the bedside lamp. The figure was gone. All that remained was the room, quiet, dim, and the device glowing for no reason while my heart pounded in my throat. "What happened?" he asked, still groggy. I saw something," I said shakily, pointing at the nightstand. Right next to Ava, there was someone there. He didn't argue, but he didn't quite believe me either. He got up, checked the room, peeked down the hallway. As expected, everything was normal. We tried to sleep again, but I never closed my eyes. I stared at the device, now seemingly dormant again, but it didn't feel the same. It wasn't just a gadget anymore. I felt we were no longer alone in that room, that we hadn't been alone for days. The next morning, I said nothing. I made breakfast like always, dropped Ethan off at kindergarten, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, I couldn't erase that figure from my mind. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a shadow. It was real. That was the first night I considered unplugging the device, but I didn't. I didn't want to overreact. I didn't want to scare Daniel or Ethan. I kept telling myself it had been a hallucination, but I already knew. Something was starting to show itself, and it had begun with the voice we invited in. I tried to stay on routine, pushing aside what I had seen. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought, but my body didn't lie. I felt tense, my neck stiff, always on edge. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Daniel and I were watching a show. When it ended, we turned off the TV and the lights. The house sank into silence. I closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't rest. I hadn't slept well in days. I tossed and turned, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, until I heard something different, a whisper, gentle, barely there but real. It came from the right side, exactly where we had placed Ava. I slowly sat up, straining to hear. The voice was saying something, but the words were foreign. It sounded like a different language. Then, just as I opened my mouth to wake Daniel, the assistant spoke. "Could you please repeat that?" That's when I did wake him. I sat up and pushed his shoulder. "Did you turn it on?" I asked him. What are you talking about?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Ava..." She spoke again. She was whispering something. Daniel got up, walked over to the nightstand and looked at the device. It was silent. The light was off, but I had heard it. I swear I did. We didn't say much more that night. He went back to bed and I got up. I walked to the router, turned off the Wi-Fi, then came back and unplugged the assistant. For the first time since we brought it home, it was completely out of service. The next few days felt calmer. With no connection, no responses, the house seemed quieter. Ethan stopped waking up in tears. Daniel came home from work in good spirits, and I forced myself to believe it had all been a coincidence. Still, I felt the need to talk to someone about it. So one Sunday, while visiting my sister's house, I brought it up casually without going into detail. I asked if her Ava had ever turned on by itself. She shook her head, said sometimes it would activate if it heard something similar to its name, but she had never heard whispers or anything in another language. Other neighbors said they left their devices on overnight without any trouble. That's when something dawned on me, and it chilled me to the bone. It wasn't the device, it wasn't a glitch, it was the house. And maybe whatever was here had just been waiting for a way in. A tool, a channel. What came next wasn't a sudden dive into horror. It was a slow descent, drop by drop, until escape was no longer possible. Even though Ava remained disconnected, the days started to grow stranger. It wasn't just nighttime anymore. Things began happening during the day, with the windows wide open and the noise of the neighborhood filtering through the walls. And that disturbed me more. One afternoon, as I was washing dishes with the radio playing softly, I clearly heard a little girl's voice. "Mommy!" she screamed from the dining room. I dropped the soapy glass I was holding. I turned around instantly. The dining room was empty. I peered down the hallway. Nothing. I rushed to Ethan's room. He was fast asleep, wrapped up in his blanket, cheeks flushed, pacifier barely hanging from his mouth. Deep in slumber, but I had heard it. That voice didn't come from the street. It came from inside the house. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't know how to explain it anymore without sounding unhinged, but things kept piling up as if something new broke loose each day. Another time, while sweeping the living room, I heard my husband's voice at the front door. "I'm home." I smiled, left the broom against the wall and walked to the entrance. But there was no one there. I opened the door. Nothing. Stepped out into the hallway. Silence. I called him on his phone. "Are you back already?" "What? I'm still at work. Why?" My voice shook as I replied that I just wanted to know if he wanted his dinner warmed up. I hung up and stood in the living room, hands ice cold. It was his voice I'd heard. Not similar. Identical. Same tone. Same cadence. The exact way he says it when he comes home. I started feeling like a guest in my own house, as if it wasn't just ours anymore, as if someone or something else lived there with us. I didn't know if I was losing my mind, hallucinating, or if there really was something there. But the most terrifying part wasn't what I was hearing. It was how normal it all began to feel, as if the house had already grown used to having us. And to having it, too. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I started avoiding being alone. I went out more with Ethan, made excuses to go to the market, volunteered to run errands, anything to avoid staying inside. But it didn't matter how far I ran. Night always came. And with the night, the whisper, and with the whisper, the certainty that we weren't alone. By that point, none of us were sleeping well. Ethan would often wake up and end up in bed with us. Daniel began showing signs of exhaustion. Even if he didn't say it outright, his eyes said what his mouth wouldn't. He knew something was wrong. Still, we tried to hold it together. Ava stayed in her box, unplugged, no cable, no connection, no voice. The modem was turned off every night, and for a few days it gave us a bit of peace. But it was only a pause. A false breath before the next blow. One night, exactly at 2:50 a.m., I began hearing something. At first I thought it was part of a dream, a low murmur, almost like heavy breathing. I sat up, confused. Daniel was still asleep. The room was dark. Then I heard it clearly, a metallic, familiar voice repeating slowly, "We won't leave you alone, never, pause, never, pause. We won't leave you." My skin prickled with fear. I reached out and shook Daniel's arm. "Wake up, it's talking. Ava is talking." He opened his eyes, groggy. "What? How? It's unplugged?" The phrase kept repeating, not loudly, but just enough to feel like it was being whispered right into my ear, like the voice came from inside the room, inside us. We jumped out of bed, turned on the light, walked to the box where we'd stored the assistant. And there it was, right in front of us, the device speaking that phrase, disconnected. No power, no Wi-Fi, no reason. Daniel reached for the box, and just then the voice stopped. Ava tipped over inside it as if released from a grip, and silence returned, thick and suffocating. We stared at each other, speechless. Neither of us had an explanation. It wasn't about glitches or strange lights or distant sounds anymore. It was direct, a clear threat. We took the box out of the bedroom, placed it in the backyard, among old rags and rusty tools. The next morning, we didn't speak a word during breakfast. Ethan, oblivious, played with his cereal like nothing had happened. Despite the fear, despite how unreal it all felt, we kept pretending everything was normal, but something inside me had fractured, because I knew then this wasn't going to stop, not by unplugging it, not by pretending. The voice we heard that night wasn't Ava. It was something else, using her shape, her sound, her access, something that no longer needed a connection to be here. And even though I didn't want to admit it, it was already inside our home. After that night, something shifted in our family. The tension became palpable, as if the house itself no longer belonged to us. Ethan began having frequent nightmares. He would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, his eyes distant, as if he was seeing things we couldn't. But the worst came one morning while I was dressing him for kindergarten. I noticed a bruise on his right shoulder, as if someone had gripped him tightly. "Did you fall, sweetheart?" I asked gently. He looked down, didn't answer, just shrugged. I didn't want to alarm Daniel. I kept it to myself. Thought of all the logical possibilities: roughhousing at the park, a bump at school, an accident. I clung to reason. But 2 days later, Daniel woke up with a similar mark on his back. Red streaks, like scratches. He tried to laugh it off, said maybe he scratched himself in his sleep, but the laugh was hollow. That same night, I woke up with a burning sensation in my leg. The next morning, I found a mark too. Not a scratch, but more like pressure. As if something had grabbed me from inside. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Then one early morning, Daniel woke me without a word. He was pale, hands trembling. He stared at me and said, "That wasn't you. Sitting at the foot of the bed, right?" I sat up, confused. "What are you saying?" He swallowed hard. "I saw someone. I thought it was you. Sitting there, staring at the door." Then she got up and walked slowly to the corner. "I thought you were going to the bathroom, but when I turned, you were still lying next to me." I felt the blood drain from my body. I didn't know what to say. There was no explanation. And worst of all, I couldn't tell him that I, too, had felt the mattress sink, as if someone had sat down beside me just minutes before. From that day on, we stopped pretending. It wasn't about devices or strange phrases anymore. This was something physical, present, active, and we knew it. It was touching us, testing us, and it seemed that the more we ignored it, the stronger it became. Daniel suggested we sleep together in the living room. We moved mattresses, rearranged furniture, but the atmosphere stayed the same. Ethan still woke up at the same hour. The marks kept appearing. I no longer felt like a mother or a wife. I felt like a hostage, and worst of all, we didn't know how to expel what we had never invited in, but now lived among us. We reached a point where we didn't know what else to do. The nights were torture. We barely slept, lived in fear, avoided being alone in the house. Even Ethan, just 5 years old, seemed to sense that something terrible was happening. He stopped playing, like before, grew quieter, more withdrawn, refused to be alone in his room. Sometimes he wouldn't even go into the bathroom unless the door was wide open. We tried everything we knew. We started praying. Then a neighbor suggested egg-cleansing rituals. We did them for several days. The shell would crack in the water, forming strange shapes. Once, it looked like a face. Another time, it made bubbles that wouldn't pop. I didn't want to believe in that, but we had nothing else left. We went to East Austin. People say you can find anything there, and it's true. We met several specialists, but most just wanted our money. One asked for a photo of Ethan. Another charged us a fortune for a blessed candle from a secret cave. None of it worked. In fact, after one of those rituals, things got worse. That night, loud knocks echoed from Ethan's room. Daniel recorded them on his phone. The next day, the audio had a voice in the background. It wasn't human. It was a deep growl, saying something none of us could understand. We were at the brink of collapse, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Until, through the suggestion of Mrs. Rosario, an elderly neighbor from the next street over, we met Mr. Thomas. He was close to 80, slender, with large weathered hands and deep-set eyes. He didn't charge anything. All he asked was to visit the house first. He said if he didn't sense anything, he wouldn't agree to intervene. He arrived on a Friday, just after noon. The moment he stepped through the door, his expression changed. He moved slowly through the living room, then into the kitchen. He didn't speak, he just watched. When he reached the hallway that led to Ethan's room, he came to a full stop. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath. Nobody died here. But something was summoned. That's exactly how he said it. Blunt, clear. He explained that most likely the people who lived here before us had performed rituals in the house, not to harm, but to attract something. Energies, favors, protection. But sometimes those doors don't close properly. And sometimes what comes in doesn't want to leave. He asked to perform a cleansing the following day at exactly 3 in the afternoon. He said that was the most effective hour. We didn't know whether to believe him, but at that point we had no options left. But you two need to leave, he warned us. Only one can stay. We decided I would stay. Not out of courage, but instinct. A deep need to understand. I wanted to see for myself what was rotting our home from the inside. Saturday came. A little before 3, Daniel left with Ethan to his sister's house. He looked at me with worry. We didn't say much, just hugged tightly. I was done pretending to be strong. Inside, my whole body trembled. It was a real, suffocating kind of fear, the kind that knots your stomach and steals your breath. Mr. Thomas arrived right on time. He carried a simple cloth bag with the essentials, no black candles or bizarre symbols, just a bundle of incense, coarse salt, a bottle of water, and a small old clay bowl. He also had a palm cross and a tiny obsidian jaguar figurine. He asked me to close all doors and windows, then to turn everything off, lights, radio, phone. Silence is necessary, he said. I nodded without asking. He began in the kitchen, sprinkled the salt in a semicircle near the entrance and lit the incense. The smoke rose thick and slow. He started to pray in Nahuatl, with a tone I'd never heard before. His voice was low but unwavering, like he wasn't afraid of what he was confronting, or rather what he was trying to drive out. I stood beside the table, frozen. There was a pressure in my chest, like something had lodged itself between my ribs. The temperature dropped instantly. I noticed because my skin prickled and the sweat on my hands turned cold. Mr. Thomas moved into the dining area. There, he placed the clay bowl and the jaguar figurine. His prayers grew louder. He marked a cross on the floor using the white ash left from the burnt incense. That's when something happened. A kitchen knife we had left on the counter suddenly flew toward him. It didn't just fall, it was launched, as if thrown by an invisible force with clear intent. Mr. Thomas stepped aside just in time. The knife embedded itself in the drywall with a hard thud. He didn't scream, didn't flinch. He just stared at the corner where he had stood moments before and spoke calmly. There you are. You don't want to leave. But you will. He returned to the center of the living room. The smoke was thicker now. I couldn't stop crying. Not from fear, but as if something in the air was pushing me to break. Mr. Thomas was drenched in sweat, his clothes clinging to his frame, his eyes glossy, as if he were seeing something I couldn't. Then came a heavy, dead silence. The incense had completely burned out. The old man collapsed into a chair, breathing hard. It fought back. That's good. What fights, leaves. What stays quiet, hides. I didn't know if he had succeeded. All I knew was that the house no longer felt the same, and neither did I. That evening, Daniel and Ethan returned around 7. I didn't tell them everything. I just said the ritual had been intense, that Mr. Thomas was exhausted, but he believed it had worked. Daniel looked at me in silence, as if wanting to ask more, but he didn't push. Deep down, I think neither of us wanted to reopen what we had been through. We stored Ava back in her box. This time, we wrapped it in multiple layers of plastic and placed it at the top of the wardrobe, out of reach, out of sight. Daniel even joked weakly about tossing it in the trash or gifting it to a neighbor, but we both knew no one else should ever have it. We didn't know if the device itself was to blame, but we weren't about to take that chance. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to improve. Ethan stopped waking up in tears. He returned to sleeping in his room. At first, he still asked to leave the hallway light on, but little by little he regained his joy. I felt calmer too. The house breathed differently. No more whispers, no shadows, no sudden drops in temperature. We slept with the door closed again, without fear. It seemed like everything was over, but something remained within me. A feeling I can't quite explain, as if whatever had left hadn't truly gone. As if it had left behind a residue, something invisible, something you don't see but you sense. Sometimes, when I'm washing dishes, I feel someone standing behind me. I turn, no one's there. Other times, when I pass by Ethan's room, I think I hear a faint echo, a whisper, but when I listen closely, there's only silence. I've learned to live with that doubt, to stop looking for explanations, to avoid reopening doors we barely managed to close. Mr. Thomas told us these things don't always disappear. Sometimes they hide. Sometimes they come back if you make space for them again. That's why we've never turned Ava back on. We haven't even touched it. It sits there on top of the wardrobe, covered, forgotten, or at least we pretend it is. Because the truth is, no box can contain what has already seeped into the air, into the walls, into memory. I'm not sharing this to scare you, or to convince you of anything. But if you've ever felt like a device in your home understood you a little too well, if you heard a phrase no one said, or a voice in a room where no one was standing, you might not be as alone as you think. And if you're thinking of bringing one of those digital assistants into your home, think twice, because sometimes it's not the device that's speaking. It's something else, something that just needed a channel to come through.